I'm June Gruber, an associate professor of psychology at the University of Colorado Boulder and director of this mental health expert series. I'm here today with Dr. Robert Levenson, a professor of psychology and director of the Berkeley Psychophysiology Laboratory at the University of California, Berkeley. Thanks for being here today, Bob.
Thanks, June. Nice to see you again.
You too. I was wondering if you could start by just saying a little bit about the kind of mental health research you do.
Yeah, I'm really proud to be able to say that after many, many decades of being on the periphery of that area, I actually have a part of the work that I'm doing now that really is mental health research. And I've gotten interested in the last decade or so in the mental health problems that are experienced by people who are caring for family members with dementia, different kinds of late life dementia and related disorders. And it turns out that this is a group kind of overlooked. They're caring for people who have very dramatic diseases that change cognition and emotion and motor functioning. And they're doing God's work, taking care of their loved ones. And they have about a 4 times higher rate of depression, clinical depression, than people in their age group who are not doing this kind of caregiving, and about three times the rate of anxiety disorders. So this, for me, is a really unique opportunity. We have a population that we know is at extraordinarily heightened risk for developing these disorders. We kind of know what the trigger is and when it occurs and when it ends. And as basically an experimental psychologist, it's an opportunity to do mental health research with a lot more of the degrees of freedom under my control than would normally be the case in mental health research. So I've kind of jumped on this, and we're doing a lot of work, including now we're doing randomized control trial interventions in the community. We have 2 underway right now, and we just submitted a grant to do 3 more. So yeah, I'm a mental health researcher.
That's amazing. When did you first get started doing, or how did you go about getting started doing this particular kind of mental health research?
Yeah, well, if you want to really go back, I was thinking for this interview how I got sort of interested in it. And when I was in college, I had gone to Georgetown, and I was in the Foreign Service School, and I was getting trained to be a member of the deep state, you know, that would plan the overthrow of all successive governments. And it was a time historically where there were a lot of protests on the campus, and I was very involved in that. And I started to think that a career in government service was not for me. And I moved into psychology as a possible, you know, alternative major. And as part of that, I volunteered to, originally as a volunteer and then as a paid worker, I went out to a place called Chestnut Lodge, which was outside of Washington in Rockville. And Chestnut Lodge was, at the time, was a very famous psychiatric hospital, sort of the hospital of last resort for people who had intractable psychiatric illnesses. And it was run by a group of psychoanalytically oriented therapists, the most famous of whom were Harry Stack Sullivan and Frieda Fromm-Reichmann. And they were sort of Freudians and neo-Freudians, and they had this idea that you could treat people with psychosis without medication, having intensive daily psychoanalytic sessions, and that you could address they didn't call them negative symptoms in that time, but the sort of the deficits in social functioning and what we would call positive emotion by what they call milieu therapy, which was creating a supportive, kind, and active environment where even though you had these debilitating mental illnesses, you went about life. You know, you might have a job, you might you have friends, you do things, you go to movies. And so they hired a bunch of people like me to kind of create this milieu where they were around young people who would talk to them about the activities of the day and would take them places. And then there was a version of research going on where at the end of your shift, you would fill out these elaborate reports about what happened and what people did. And I found it quite wonderful and fascinating. And it was a wonderful introduction into something that doesn't exist anymore. Being exposed to psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar disease in its raw, unblunted form, and seeing people in the worst moments of their life, and then also in between, where we might talk about politics or go bowling or go out to a restaurant for lunch. And I think, looking back, took a while, but I think that's what really hooked me.
And since then, having that just sounds like just amazing, like first person, real human experience. To today, I mean, as you reflect over the trajectory of your career, what sort of stands out to you as some notable frustrations, but also successes that you've really savored or held on to?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking for this interview about that experience and how formative it was.
Yeah.
And I know people are going to be watching this or probably building their careers. And I think, one lesson for me was sometimes the formative moments in your life come in really unexpected ways. I mean, I did not see myself as ever being a psychologist. I wanted to be a politician or a diplomat. And, but being open to it, and I think the things that I learned from that really have shaped everything I've done since is, first of all, as psychologists, we often do research behind a curtain, literally and figuratively. It's like we always are 2 or 3 steps removed from the phenomenon of interest. And one of the things I learned at Chestnut Lodge is that you can get up close and look at nature in its kind of vivid, unclean, unsanitized, all of its warts exposed way, and that maybe that's the best way to do research. And that's been a real theme in everything I've done. From when I started doing emotion research, I wanted to really study real emotion. I didn't want people to tell me what they thought they felt, but I wanted to put them in situations where they were fighting with their loved ones, and and being challenged by seeing things that were really powerfully evocative, and then observing and seeing what happened. And I think a lot of that for me goes back to that Chestnut Lodge experience of it's not it's a little frightening in the abstract, but once you sort of take the curtain away, if you have your scientist mind and eyes, it's really an exhilarating way to see the world. And I think the frustration for me in research is often in psychology is that we get so far away. We're the meta of the meta of the meta, as opposed to the phenomenon. Where how do you think about the way you think about thinking about the phenomenon, and that removal, safe, on our perch, is a huge frustration. And I know for me, it's always been a struggle to get closer to the unbridled phenomena.
I remember too, over the years, Bob, the best advice I had heard you give trainees was to observe the real phenomenon before they go begin to try to study it.
Yeah, now I'm thinking, and then study it as closely as you can. And I think we're talking about mental health research, and I'm not, I don't speak with the authority that I might on something else, but let's face it, we very rarely look at people who aren't behind the screen of powerful central nervous system depressant medication, drugs that not only have powerful effects in the moment, but they have lasting effects as well, retuning the psychological apparatus in powerful ways and transformative ways. And, obviously we can't get people off meds and whatnot, but, and studying people not in their real lives, in situations that are very, very far removed from them. And, that's part of our tradition, is to do things in laboratories, but still I think the frustration is how do we find ways to get closer to seeing people in the real world? And, and again, the Chestnut Lodge lesson is that the real world is not just the moments where you're floridly psychotic or depressed, beyond the ability to get out of bed, but the in-between moments. And that's been encouraging. And I know you do some of this kind of work, but looking at people in the refractory periods, between episodes as really a time to study, the triggers and the things that cause. I think those are all steps in the right direction.
I really love the way, just even thinking of how, as you put it, as how people unfold over time during acute periods of suffering and the in-betweens, and even periods of resilience and recovery, just a full spectrum, as you're saying, of the real human mind and real emotions and experiences.
Yeah, the bounce back capacity that people have, we call it resilience or whatever, but whether it's caused by a psychotic disorder or it's caring for someone who is really a critical part of your world, who is fading away and disappearing and then dying, and then how do you become you again? That's part of the syndrome. It's a part of the syndrome of psychosis. It's a part of the syndrome of caregiving, and it's in some ways it's probably just as important. And maybe we could relearn things from that other side of the the curve, the recovery side, that tell us other things about these diseases, as how they retune our ability to change and adapt. And anyway, I think the whole arc is important. And and not to pick on questionnaires, but we've been talking for 15 minutes and we haven't, so maybe we should. But when you ask somebody, how sad are you on a 1 to 5 scale, it misses so much of the dynamics of the lives. And I know that in the era now with repeated sampling and EMA and the new methodologies, and we're getting closer to be able to study those sort of perturbations over time. But we can't rest on our laurels, and think that okay is good enough. This is important research, mental health research, and we want to do it as well as we can, and we want to get as close to the real phenomenon with all of its complexities.
I mean, that touches on a question I was going to ask that you're speaking to, which is, what do you see as the most important next steps for the future of this field?
It's a funny field because we've gotten really quite good at alleviating distress in a lot of disorders. I mean, psychology and the social sciences really made great progress in dealing with anxiety and some depression and some kinds of depression or whatever. We've really been able to help people, I think, to go on with their lives a little bit. But we have no preventative treatments. We have no cures. We have no real biomarkers that are early. They're established treatment targets. We in some ways we have. I mean, if you want to be really harsh, we've had no real breakthroughs in pharmacology, or the more the promise of biological treatments is still a promise. So where are we compared to where we would have been 40, 50 years ago when I was starting to get into this field? We have some interesting models. We have some really good ways of dealing with symptoms, but we haven't made the deep impact that we would have liked to have made. And that's the challenge. I mean, I think and the hard thing, as I sort of float on the periphery of this work, is how do we keep up our energy and our commitment to going after those, to find cures. I mean, it's almost like when you say it, you think, oh, how naive. How do we prevent and treat mental illness? I mean, it's the same question, but not to give up on that. And we have a lot of obstacles. We have the limitation of our methods. We have the problems of access to the populations, and then we have this, this diagnostic system, which might be useful for some things, but it really interferes with our ability to do clear, incisive research, because we're not sure exactly what we're studying when we get a group of people who have a DSM disorder like autism. You know, we are ending up with a mixed bag, and that's not where we want to be to do really meaningful breakthrough research.
So then, thinking about the kind of gaps and shortcomings and where we need to really push the field, what advice would you have for, those who might be watching this interview today, whether they're maybe students or scholars or the public, who do want to get engaged in the field or are interested in it?
Yeah, well, of course, the first thing you would say is, what are the methods that that are on the scene now that are really important? And if we had done this interview 10 years ago, I would be saying, psychologists need to be better biologists, and we need to learn more about the brain, and we also need to know more about the gene and genetics, and we need to know more about pharmacology. I mean, that would have been the sort of, and I think that holy trinity is probably still true. Molecules, cells, and genes are probably a pretty important part of what we need to know a little bit more about. But I think there's some other things we need to know too. Like, I think we need to become better anthropologists and ethologists. I think we're losing our edge when it comes to observational research, and we're getting a little lazy. Like, we're now quite enamored in my field with computer-assisted coding of emotion. Well, yeah, it's great, makes your life a lot easier. But those eyes and those kind of observational chops you develop from learning how to code behavior, those are really powerful things for clinicians. I would think that it's important to work in university training clinics and experience people who have the kinds of problems that come in. But it's really important to have experience with some of the more difficult disorders. The addictions, the psychoses, things that in some programs, like our program, you really don't see that unless you go out of your way and get an externship. So, we might be cutting out some of the most important areas for mental health research and intervention and putting it outside of the experience of a lot of our students. So I think, getting that kind of chestnut lodge experience, but in the modern era, really, really important as well. And then, we are living in an era where big data are going to be very important. And, it's easy to say, well, that's going to be our salvation. It probably isn't, but to be able to work with those kinds of public available data sets, and to harness the power of large numbers of data points, I think learning how to do that's going to really be useful. So it's some of the same and it's some new stuff, but I think none of this can be at the expense of learning about the phenomenon, experiencing it, really understanding. It's the most valuable part in generating hypotheses that are going to create good research and good research careers.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. That was great. And thank you again for speaking today.
Okay, good to see you.
Good to see you too.